Greetings. I'm Kent Dobson. I've been a part of this church for a little while, and I'm happy to be with you, weary snow travelers, braving the perils of Mordor. So, shall we begin? Matthew chapter 16, please. Just to give you a little heads up, I'm going to do a little bit of teaching, and then we'll take communion together, and which I'm excited about to do with all of you. And then I'll try and draw a few thoughts together at the end, after we do some singing during communion. Matthew chapter 16, verse 25. Jesus is in the middle of a discussion with his disciples, and his disciples, particularly one in particular, Peter, has said some pretty important things, namely like, I think you're the Messiah. Jesus says, well done, Peter, just don't tell anyone. Okay. Then they move on from there, and then they start getting into a discussion, and Jesus starts leading them in a very unusual direction. Notice, please, verse 25. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. I find this verse very interesting and compelling, and it's also, honestly, a little bit strange. I mean, who talks like this? If you want to save your life, you must lose it. It sounds like some kind of strange proverb or some kind of Eastern phrase. I guess it is an Eastern phrase since the Bible is an Eastern book, but it doesn't really seem to resonate with sort of our way of looking at the world, sort of the Western enlightened consciousness that we sort of carry around. What does it mean to lose your life? More than that, Jesus says if you're busy trying to save it, that's the very thing, that's the wrong direction. It's not the right way to go. But isn't it funny? Because that's how Christians talk often about their salvation. I got saved, or you need to get saved, or I'm so glad I'm saved, versus the rest of you who apparently aren't saved. But Jesus seems to start this discussion by saying if that's all you want, to get saved, you'll end up losing your life. And then he says if you want to find salvation, you've got to let go. You've got to lose. I want to ask tonight if that's really true. If Jesus is serious about this. If this is the path of salvation that he's trying to lead us into. I want to look at this text from a couple of different angles. The first way I'd like to approach it is as a question of Lent. We have now entered into the season of Lent here at Mars Hill, starting with Ash Wednesday. Did anybody come to the Ash Wednesday service? Anyone? Okay. Big fans, like, yeah, Ash Wednesday. Yeah, nothing better than getting together with your friends and saying, I'm going to die, and rubbing ashes on your head. A good time. Don't miss it next year. Seriously, there's something really powerful about just admitting our own mortality and saying, God, we need you. We need your forgiveness. And we've entered into that season. This is the first Sunday of Lent. And Lent, just from a traditional point of view, is the time of year where the Christian church journeys with Jesus for 40 days leading up to his death and resurrection. It's 40 days of preparing for that death and resurrection. And typically, in Christian thought, this is, from a metaphoric point of view, Jesus' descent. He descends into suffering and death, and then he's resurrected. And once a year, as a church, we get to do the same. We get to walk with Jesus down this path of descent into suffering and be resurrected in him. By the way, Paul uses the same language when he talks about baptism. You're supposed to die with Christ and be resurrected. And Lent is very powerful because once a year you're reminded of that cycle. It's not just about Jesus did it all for us. No, we get to journey with him into it. And I want to ask, in part, what this little phrase, saving your life, losing your life, has to do with Lent and the Lenten season, as it's called. Lent comes, first of all, from the word spring. Meaning like, not spring like water, but spring as in not fall and winter and, what's the other one? Summer. Thank you. It comes from the word spring. And that simple meaning is very helpful in terms of our understanding of what Lent is. Yes, it is a time of looking inside, taking an honest look at yourself, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But it's also a time that carries with it a lot of joy and a lot of hope. How many of you seriously wanted to just start crying when it was 43 degrees this week? Anyone? I did. Taking off my jacket and leaping around, it's so warm, it's 43. And then, winter storm warning, storm of the century is coming, and then back into depression we go. But spring is that in-between time of year. We haven't quite left winter, and we haven't arrived yet at summer. But there's a lot of hope, a lot of joy. If it's just slightly warm in western Michigan, people are like, ah. And that's what Lent is about. It is a journey downward, but it also carries with it hope and spring. And what I guess in Christian language we would call a holy spring. Jesus' own descent into death and resurrection. Like the poem T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of dead land. You probably had to memorize it when you were in the 9th grade or whatever. Probably not. Not anymore. Education's going downhill. I don't know. Maybe it is. But it's this time where, yes, there's a lot of hope. Something beautiful is emerging, but there's a lot of deadness around. That's what Lent's about. So let's embrace that. Let's embrace the tension of the cruelest time of year where we haven't quite arrived in summer and we haven't quite left winter. I want to start with a phrase. Let's look at it, please. Who you are right now is who you are. I know it sounds kind of like a deep thought by Jack Handy. So let's just admit it. Who you are right now is who you are. You're not the person from last week or last year or 5 years ago. You're only the person you are right now sitting in your seat. And you're not the person you hope to be in the future. You are only who you are right now. Let me give you some examples of what I'm trying to say. If you're like me, you spend some time in your head. And some of you probably like to spend time thinking about what happened then. Last week, this weekend, the week before last year. And some of you like to conjure up the good things. Like, man, I was so successful last year. And people liked me, or I don't know. And you start reliving some of your memories. And you start going down a particular path of dwelling on those thoughts and memories from the past. Or some of you are dwelling on the bad stuff, like that relationship that just completely imploded. And you start going over in your mind, what could I have done differently? What if I would have said this and not this? Or why did I react like this and not this? Or why was I angry here when I could have just simply let it go? Or why didn't I go right instead of left? Maybe this accident would have never happened. Now the problem isn't with memory, like we remember stuff. The problem is when you start to live there. And you start to go over and over and over and over and in your mind. Refusing to live in this present moment. Right now. Because you only are who you are right now. Not the person back then. Others of you like to live in the future. Now, I happen to teach high school, so I'm well aware of this. My high school students say, when I graduate, then I'll be a serious person. What they don't know, as soon as they get to college, they say, when I graduate from college, then I'll be a serious person. Then I'll get my act together. But as soon as you graduate from college, you think, nobody does anything when they first graduate from college. I'm going to mess around for a while. Then you turn 30 like me, and you think, real adults are 40. And you start, when I get there, or sometimes it's accomplishments. When I get this job, and when I have this amount of money, and when I have this car, then I will have arrived. And you start building up these things in your mind. What you will be, or who you want people to think you are or will be. Now the problem again isn't with dreams and hopes. I guess we all have dreams and hopes. The problem is when you start living there in your mind over and over and over again, thinking about what's going to happen in the future. How many of you honestly have very long conversations with people in your head? Anyone? Come on now. Oh yeah. I can have some good ones. Epic conversations with people. And I know full well I'll probably never have them. There's that one person that I just want to confront. I'm going to tell them how it is, and that is going to be the way it is, and they better shut their mouth and listen. Right? And you can spend hours. Or I like to have conversation with, important people like Bono. Anybody had a conversation with Bono in their head? Dang, I'm the only one. Okay, yes. I'm not alone. Yeah, sure. Oh, it's a good conversation. At least mine was. Okay, good. Or other people like George Bush and whatever, I don't know. But dreaming up scenarios and spending time there, going over in your mind what you would say if you ever had that opportunity. What that starts to do, my friends, is create a false sense of who you are. What I'd like to call tonight the false self, which I'll try and explain. I'm stealing this line straight from Thomas Merton. So if you don't know who Thomas Merton is, you have Google. The false self, this false sense of self. I'll give you a kind of an embarrassing, funny example. I used to be in a band in high school. I've been in several bands, and they've all been really bad. But the worst one was the band I was in high school. And the name says it all. Original Bomb Child. Yep, that was the name of our band. It's a dumb name. And the songs were even worse, honestly. What was interesting about my band experience is I spent a lot of time in my head composing, not songs, but my Grammy acceptance speech. Oh yeah. I was all about it. Just, and it was going to be an anti-establishment speech, in case you're wondering. Just like down with the system and pop music and candy-coated, I don't know. Just down with the system and let's embrace indie music. I don't know what it was. But something like this. And I spent a lot of time, honestly, I'm being honest with you, composing something that I knew full well would never happen. Especially since I wasn't, practicing and playing gigs and recording, songs. Perhaps if I would have stopped composing a Grammy award-winning speech, I could have actually written a song. Who knows? Now again, the problem isn't having dreams. The problem is when you start to live there. And you only live in your head and you refuse to accept this moment. The moment you're in right now. The moment that you need to be present to. Let me give you a couple more examples that are a little bit different. Let's say you are more conservative by temperament, by sort of perspective. Your voting reflects it. Your choice, your language reflects it. Your family values reflect it. Whatever. You're more conservative, which is fine. But you're sitting there waiting for me to say something liberal. Like, I know he's going to do it. I know he's going to... just come on. I didn't come here to be disappointed. Give it to me. I'll give you one. God is our mother. Oh no! He said it. God is our father. I knew it. He's a liberal. He is floating in a sea of postmodern jargon. I'm so glad I'm right and he's wrong. Now, if you do that to me, which I hope I can handle, You're probably going to do that in every moment of your life. In every situation, you're going to look to categorize and judge and put people in little compartments so you can say, they are there and I am here. They are wrong and I am right. What that leads to is a false sense of the self. A false self. Putting yourself over and against other people by categorizing and judging. Or let's take it the other way around. Let's say you're more liberal by temperament. You're free. You don't need any of this neoconservative whatever. And you're just waiting for me to say something conservative. He can't possibly be cool. And you're just waiting for me to mess up and say something like, I believe in moral absolutes. And you're instantly, morality is a socially constructed linguistic web. What does he know? And absolutes, the only absolute is there are no absolutes. Because I've arrived, and I'm liberated, and I'm free, and he's caught in the shackles of modernity. Or whatever. So, there you have it. And if you do that to me now, you're going to do that in every situation. You're going to categorize and judge and begin to create and promote a false sense of who you are. What I think Jesus is inviting us into in this phrase about losing yourself, about letting go of yourself, is He's inviting us into a kind of death. We like to create and promote and protect this false sense of the self. Let me share kind of another round 2 embarrassing story, but a true one nonetheless. I used to work here doing the music for 3 or 4, almost 4 years. Some of you were around, some of you probably weren't. Those of you who are around, thanks for putting up with me and allowing me to learn the guitar in public. Don't recommend it in the future, but thank you. And during the course of sort of my time here, I had this increasing sense that I would like to know a little bit more about the Bible. I knew almost nothing about the Bible, and because my own faith was becoming increasingly important to me, I wanted to go for it in a little bit of a deeper way. So we decided to move to Israel. And I moved to Israel with my wife, and at that time we just had one kid, Lucy. When we moved there, I think she was 2.5. And we moved to Israel, and I enrolled in a program there, and sort of completely left our life here and went to a very foreign place. Now, Israel is the kind of place that if you let it, it will shatter all your expectations of what you thought it was. I mean, anything that you conjure up in your mind, the Holy Land, the this, that, it will just destroy your preconceived notions if you'll let it. And it did that for me, very much so. And it also sort of destroyed my expectations of I'm going to be in school all day long just soaking up wonderful All right. The truth of the matter is we had to get groceries. Now, we didn't have a car, so we had to walk to the grocery store. And it's 110 degrees. And you have to walk uphill on the way home, putting all of 25 grocery bags on the stroller. You know, like those little umbrella strollers, and pushing it uphill thinking, what am I doing here again? This is the Holy Land? No, it's not. But that was our life there. It only took us about 4 months to realize that, hey, if you simply ask to have your groceries delivered, they do it for free. Huh. Who would have thought? You live and learn, you know. And also, it was a very sort of politically tense time. Buses were blowing up, cafes were blowing up, suicide bombings, Palestinians were being killed by Israeli military. It was a tense time. I mean, it's tense now, but it was even more tense when we first moved over there. And it definitely had a way of shaking us up. I remember sitting there one night typing away at the computer about something ridiculous, you know, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic junk. And all of a sudden our apartment just shook and my computer slid across the table because a suicide bomber walked into a cafe down the street from our house, a cafe that we used to go to, and blew himself up. that will, of course, stop you dead in your tracks and say, what in the world am I doing here? It was that kind of experience for us. We've lived there twice, but that was the first time we moved there. That was what our experience was like. And you'd think we would have returned to Michigan, which we did. I would have returned to Michigan sort of broken and humble and sort of shattered. But instead I came back to Michigan angry and disillusioned and confused and a little bit bitter and also filled with a bunch of information, knowledge, which graduate school tends to do to people, and has, at least for me, had a way of sort of puffing up my ego. Man, I really know something, and nobody else really knows anything. And did you hear such and such a sermon? They don't even know anything about, you know? And that's the person I came back as, angry and bitter and judgmental and thinking I had somehow arrived, you know. I was experiencing real life while the rest of you were watching American Idol. You know, that's sort of how I felt. Which, by the way, didn't lend itself very well to me getting a job. So I kind of just floated around and did a little teaching here and there, led a few trips to Israel, and was really lost and a little bit depressed. I found myself in the middle of winter with no job. 2 kids now. We had another child, a boy named Jonas, which we may or may not have named after the Weezer song. Just leave that sort of as a question mark. And I found myself without a job, and I couldn't pay the bills. We were living in a house that was more of a charity situation, and didn't have a car. My brother went to Iraq and left us his car, and so I was driving around in a borrowed vehicle, and I couldn't pay the bills. You know, I had a master's degree, you know, I mean, a lot of good it was doing me. And so the only thing I could do to sort of make ends meet for a little while was deliver phone books. Yes, people do that. Some of you don't know that. You think it just magically appears. Oh, phone book. Who would have thought? The phone fairy arrived and dropped off the little phone. No, people do it. I did it. There's no shame in that, by the way. And I'll come back to that. But that's what I found myself doing, delivering phone books. Just driving around in my brother's Avalon, which, by the way, when you load it with phone books, in the trunk, in the back seat, the floor, the front seat of the floor, your lap, and the dash, it's a lowrider. It's nice. So I'm just cruising in my lowrider Avalon, delivering phone books. And I chose, which I regretted, Rockford. I regretted it for a couple of reasons. One, I realized the houses are too far apart. And so you waste more gas and you have to run, and some people have dogs, and so Rockford's bad. And the second reason why it was a bad choice is because that's where I went to high school. So I found myself looking at people's houses that I knew, thinking, oh God, please don't let them come to the door. I haven't seen them in 10 years, and they'll open the door and I'll be holding a phone book. Hey, aren't you? Yeah, here's your phone book. Okay, bye. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with delivering phone books. In fact, I should have been thankful that this is a way that I could pay the bills and survive. But I think the problem was that I was obsessed with who I thought I was. I deserve more. I've got a master's degree. I should have just, rolled it up and smoked it or something. I don't know. Probably would have done me more good. Because I felt like, I've arrived and nobody... That was the problem. The problem wasn't delivering phone books. The problem was with me. I had created a false sense of who I thought I was. What I'd like to call tonight the false self. I deserve more. I'm important. I'm better than. And Jesus' invitation is to let that self die, to let go of it, to descend, what I would call the death of the false self. That's what needs to die. I think that's why Jesus uses this language. If you want to save your life, you're going to lose it. But the second you lose your life and you let go of that false self, you suddenly find yourself in the arms of God, saying, I accept you for who you are right now in this moment. Not the person you think you are or the thing that you promote. You don't have to convince me of anything. God simply says, I accept you now. If you'll let that die. And it's going to be a little bit painful. It is painful to look in the mirror and say, all right, here I am. I cannot pretend. You can spend a lot of time pretending. But if you take a long look in the mirror, it is hard. And some of you are going to look in the mirror and think, I'm not that special. I'm not that great. Hey, me neither. It's a little bit like dying. It's a little painful. To be able to look in the mirror, for example, and say, you know what? I'm overweight. I don't want to be overweight, but that's where I am. This is the person I am right now in this moment. And God says, okay. I accept you for who you are. Or if you say, I'm skinny. I know I'm too skinny. People tell me I'm too skinny. People say, you need to eat more. I am tired of people saying that. Okay. Take a look in the mirror and say, this is who I am right now. And I've got some problems, but I'm going to accept this present moment. Or maybe you're in a completely different kind of scenario. I was talking to someone after the first service, and they said, I used to be involved in a church, and it collapsed, and now I find myself in a job that I absolutely hate and despise, wondering, where is God? Now, I know what that feels like. To say, this is where I am, is a hard thing. I'm nobody else than who I am right now in this moment. And Lent, by the way, is an invitation to do that. This isn't a one-time deal where you say, I'm suddenly been liberated. And now I'm never going to have any problems again. No, Lent is something that happens every year. That's why cycles in the church and rituals in the church that are on a calendar year can be so powerful and so meaningful. Because once a year you can take a look in the mirror and say, what kind of self have I been promoting this year? Can I stand once again honestly and vulnerably before God? And you've got to die again. Turn to John chapter 3 for just a second, because Jesus also uses some very important language that's connected to some of this stuff. John chapter 3. This is a fairly famous encounter if you've sort of been around church stuff for a while, church language and so forth. This is a discussion between Jesus and a Pharisee named Nicodemus. And it's a very interesting discussion. I mean, you can read it the whole thing sometime on your own if you want. What verse? Verse 3. Jesus replied, very truly I tell you. Now, I doubt if he really said that. It's, very truly I tell you. Like true dat, I don't know. I don't know sometimes how they do these translations, but very truly I tell you. No one can see the kingdom of God without being born again. No one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again, without being born again. Once again, very strange idea if we just look it straight in the face. What is Jesus talking about here? I've already been born last time I checked. So what's he talking about? And people love to use this language. At least the kind of environment that I grew up in, this was very common language. I've been born again. She's been born again. He's not born again. I had my spiritual birthday when I was born again on such and such a date. This is kind of the kind of world I grew up in. So I'm very familiar with the language. But I don't think it's just sort of some language that you use. What's Jesus inviting you into? He's saying you've got to die. You can't be born again unless you die. And what's got to die? You have to die. Your false self has to die. It is the death of the false self. That's what's got to go. Which is a little bit painful and very vulnerable. And it's about not achieving and climbing and success and I'm going to get saved and climb. No, it's about letting go. Letting go of that person. I think back to my time driving around in the lowrider Avalon listening to Radiohead and delivering phone books. Not a highlight in my life. But God wanted to break me down. Really. Now, I don't know if He was, if God is like, watch this. I don't really have that view of the universe that He's sort of, just squeezing me under. No. But the false self needed to die. And it was slow and it was painful. And it keeps creeping up again. I'm important. I'm successful. No. You've got to let that stuff go. And it's going to feel like dying. And that's the invitation of Lent. Down into death we go with Jesus so that we can be reborn. We can have new life. We can be resurrected in Jesus. Which I think is the story of Christianity. Jesus died and came to new life again so that we can participate in the same thing. But to be born again, folks, you got to die. You got to die before you die, if you want to put it that way. Now let's look at another verse because I'd like to turn this in a slightly different direction quickly. Exodus chapter 19, please. I'd like to look at a text from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Exodus, which essentially sort of is a book that makes sense of the journey from Egypt into the desert and into what's called the Promised Land in the Bible. It just sort of tracks that journey. And it's a journey of not just one person or one individual, but an entire people group. And we're going to pick up right in the middle of this story. God is bringing them up out of Egypt, and He's bringing them into the desert. And He says a few things to the community. Exodus chapter 19, verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, or technically it's a vulture in Hebrew, but some kind of great bird, this enormous bird. How I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What's happening in this verse? God is plucking them up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, which is so perfect in terms of our overall themes of Lent during the next few Sundays, where we're talking about Egypt and leaving some stuff behind in Egypt, the false self, your addictions. Leave that stuff, that's where it needs to die. And God is bringing them up out of the house of bondage into the desert. And He's bringing him to Himself. But that's not enough. He resurrects them, not as individuals, but as a community. He says to them, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. When you die, in the spiritual sense, you're not resurrected. It's not just about you and your personal salvation, but you are resurrected as a community. Look around you. Just look around. Guess what? None of these people are all that special. They're just like you. Or all that cool or all that interesting. But God says, I will meet them where they are at and bring them into a new place and bind them together as a community. And it's not community for community's sake. A lot of good things are happening in the church these days, by the way. I think there's a deep awareness that Americans live very lonely lives. And almost sort of self-sufficiency is so worshipped by people that people live deeply lonely lives. All sometimes with the facade of I've made it and I've arrived and I'm self-sufficient and so forth and I don't need anybody. We do need one another. And a lot of good things have been happening in the church to try and remedy this. Like, let's meet together in smaller groups. Let's meet together as a neighborhood. Let's make ourselves vulnerable to one another, to the other. These are all very beautiful things. But God doesn't just stop there. Yes, He brings them together as a community, but He gives them a sense of mission and purpose. Saying, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. In other words, I'm going to bind you together and give you something to do. It's not just about you. I'm going to give you something to do. You're going to be my representatives on earth. If you journey with me, I will bring you into a kind of death and to a new life and say, now you go do it. I want to try a little exercise. Some of you are going to be like, this is like Oprah or something. Let's try it. Ready? I want us to say, life is not about us, we are about... In fact, I'll say the first line, you say the second. Life is not about us, and you say, we are about life. Ready? Life is not about us. We are about life. Really? Doesn't sound too convincing. Life is not about us. We are about life. Are you? That's a little disappointing, by the way. What do you mean life is not about us? Yes, it is. Life is about me. And my accomplishments and my salvation. No, life's not about you. Instead, you're about life. God wants to bring you through the death and resurrection and bind you together and give you a sense of purpose in this world. You're about life. You get out there and do something. Try it again. Life is not about us. Now, last time I taught here, it was also communion, which was nice. I love teaching on communion, on the day of communion, because I feel like I can only say so much. I mean, after all, there's enough talking in the world. And I can only ask so many questions in the given time, and people's attentions, I know, are all over the place. At least mine is, so I'm assuming sometimes you're jumping around too. That's fine. Communion is a different kind of thing because I can say a few things, but when we do communion, this is the real stuff. You're doing communion with your brothers and sisters in God. You are doing communion with those who are journeying down into death, into new levels of honesty about who they really are, and being resurrected in Christ. We are communing together, and we are having a kind of union with God. That's the beauty and the power of communion. So what I want to invite you to do is take communion, not as an individual, but with other people. In fact, last time I taught here, I think I remember asking you all to take communion with a stranger. Some of you were probably cursing my name. Come on. Some of you probably just went straight out the door. I'm out of here. And I know it was a little bit awkward. So, it's like, hey, hi, let's take communion together. It was hard for some of you, and this is awesome. In one of the services, I went and took communion with a guy who had driven up from Nashville. I mean, I just randomly picked someone, like, say, hey, you want to take communion together? He said, yeah. So we started talking as we were waiting in line, and he said, I drove all the way up here from Nashville to hear Rob Bell, and, it's like, oh, well, it's an awkward moment, like, okay, well, I think I'm going to pick somebody else. You find no. Anyway, so we took communion together, and he said, I don't know why, I drove all the way up here, but I think God was trying to show me something that I live with profound levels of loneliness back home. And this was a huge encouragement to me to go back to my community and to open up a little bit and show some vulnerability and realize that God has given me people that I can journey with right around me. So it was sort of a powerful time that the two of us were having as we were talking. So I'm not going to necessarily ask you to take it with a stranger, but if you want to, fine. If you're an extrovert, you're like, I'm going to find a stranger. Who is here? But I want you to not take communion alone. If you came with your family, take it with your family, or maybe you usually take it with your family, look around you and say, maybe there's somebody in my row that I always give like the Mars Hill nod to, like, hey man, no idea who you are, but, seen you around, and I'll nod at you next week, So, I don't know, just open up a little bit and say, do you want to take communion together? Because, listen, life is not about us, we are about life. And if you ask yourself, what is Mars Hill? You're looking at it, folks. Not me, not Rob, we're all a part of this place. And so that's the invitation to not do it alone. That means if you see somebody doing it alone, just like tackle them right in front of the elements. We're together! Or something, I don't know. So this is a bad idea, I'm pretty sure. But I do want to invite you to take it as a community, as a church. And then, so as the musicians come and prepare, just begin to prepare your hearts and minds for communion, for the elements, for the bread and the wine, which represent Jesus and the invitation that He is bringing us into. And then after we take communion together, I'll try and offer some final thoughts that will kind of, I hope, bring some of this together. So let me just say a quick prayer before we enter into communion. Dear God, I ask that today You would give us eyes to see and ears to hear where You are taking us. Help us to live with a profound sense of honesty about who we are, and to let go of some of the false masks that we wear, the false self that we like to promote. And give us a sense of hope that when we start to let go, we find ourselves in Your arms, in the arms of mercy and grace. And give us also a renewed awareness that You are binding us together in some kind of mysterious way, not just for ourselves, but with a sense of mission and purpose and a sense to go out and speak on behalf of You and Your kingdom. So, in the name of Jesus, amen. That was some good singing. Have a seat for 2 seconds. Lent, as I tried to say, is a season of tension. And taking a hard look in the mirror and sort of being vulnerable is sort of, there's a lot of tension in that. We're caught somewhere between death and life. Somewhere between letting go of the false self, letting go of some of our addictions that rule us, and yet we haven't quite arrived. We haven't quite been completely redeemed. We're somewhere in the middle. Lent is that sort of season of tension, and we're inviting you to stay there, to sort of stay in that place. It's also sort of symbolic in a way that in terms of our own journey as a church, Mars Hill, we're not the old Mars Hill, and we can't go back. And you can't live there in your mind. You know, trust me, you don't want to go back to when I was doing the music. I have recordings if you want proof. You can't go back there. We don't want to go back to where we used to meet. This is the shed, right? That's what Rob calls it, the shed? Okay, thanks. The other place was the hangar. I get them messed up. The hangar shed. We can't go back there. We can't go back. You can't go back to Rob's first sermon series in Leviticus. And we don't want to go back. Nor have we sort of completely arrived at the new Mars Hill, like, come, brethren, churches of the world, come learn from us. No, we're somewhere in the middle. We can't go back, and we're struggling to emerge, to be resurrected as a community. And also, I didn't want to pass up trying to follow up a little bit on what was said last week in terms of the X, Y, and Z, in terms of an intentional way participating in the poor or with the poor and the oppressed and joining the God of the oppressed and so forth. What we talked about last week. We're moving from just knowing about the poor, knowing that God cares about the poor, and on the one hand, doing something about it. We're caught in the middle. And it's a tense place. And I just want you to stay there. We are who we are right now. And you are who you are right now in this moment. With that said, I can't pass it up. Got to end with a poem. Don't y'all just love poems? I do. Stand for a second, please. This is from T.S. Eliot. He says, "The church must be forever building and always decaying and always being restored. There is much to cast down, much to build, much to restore. Let the work not delay, time and the arm not waste. Let the clay be dug from the pit, let the saw cut the stone, let the fire not be quenched in the forge." Let's do something totally campfire, ish. We're going to light a fire and sing Kumbaya. You got to hold hands. So we're building this circle of life. Come on, let's see it. It's a little. Some of you are going to be like, well, the person's too far away. I don't guess I have to hold hands. Try it. Look, like I said, you want to ask, what is Mars Hill? You're looking at it. All of you are Mars Hill. All of you are this community of believers that is trying to be resurrected. And you're also a community with a mission. The church must be forever being destroyed and being rebuilt. So, what does it say? Let the work not delay. You do something. Now, got to end with more little sayings. I made these up, so, I don't have intellectual properties. These freely came to me so we can freely use them. Okay? First after me. We are about life. Come on now. We are about life. We have two hands. We have a voice. We will join God. Again, all together. We are about life. We have two hands. We have a voice. We will